All right. My name is Andrew Julo. I'm the director of the Rusinko Center for the Arts here at St. Vincent College and the curator of St. Vincent's Art and Heritage Collections. On behalf of Father Paul Taylor and Archabbot Martin Bartel, I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening for Dr. Jennifer Thompson's lecture. Tonight's presentation coincides with the recently opened exhibition, Impressionist Legacies, the Michael and Amy Rusinko Kakos collection, now on view at the Rusinko Center. Immediately following Dr. Thompson's lecture, you're invited to view the exhibition, St. Vincent's Trolley. We are, after all, in Fred Rogers' original neighborhood. We'll be shuttling guests from the lower level of the Fred Rogers Center up to the library and back for those who'd like a ride. You won't return to those locations, so we've been encouraged by the folks from Events and Conference Services to take everything that you have with you. We would not be here today if it wasn't for the tremendous generosity of Michael and Amy Rusinko Kakos. Longtime philanthropists, the Kakoses have positively influenced the lives of countless individuals through their enduring support of early childhood literacy, access to the arts, and major initiatives in higher education, including scholarships and endowments at Penn State, Amy's alma mater, as well as Manhattan College, Stevens Institute of Technology, and Niagara University, all in New York, where Michael completed undergraduate and graduate studies. Dividing their time between Winter Park, Florida and Latrobe, the Kakoses have contributed to dozens of arts and cultural organizations for decades. Entrusting their personal collection to us here at St. Vincent engages a sustained interest in making art and education attainable for increasingly wider groups of people. Raised in nearby Mount Pleasant, Amy's love of art was encouraged by her mother, who took her to the Westmoreland Museum not long after it opened in 1959. As a teenager, she was deeply impressed by the generosity of Mary Marchand Woods, whose desire to have a cultural institution in Greensburg made art and the constellation of ideas it invites accessible to the people of her community. After meeting Michael, the two began collecting works by artists working in Impressionist and Post-Impressionist styles while living in London. In 2022, Michael and Amy graciously donated 88 works completed by 61 artists to St. Vincent, along with a $1 million endowment that supports the care and curation of the collection moving forward. It is, I think, fitting then that the debut of Michael and Amy's gift coincides with the 250th anniversary of Westmoreland County, a homecoming of sorts. St. Vincent celebrates its homecoming this weekend, and Michael and Amy are part of that. These works were given to inspire not only our academic community, but also all who call Pennsylvania their home. It was Camille Pissarro who stated, "Blessed are they who see beautiful things in humble places where other people see nothing." Michael and Amy are benefactors who recognized early that education and the arts are inexhaustible resources that have the power to transform us, motivating us to see the world and ourselves as intimately more nuanced, complex, and revelatory. We are both grateful to you. Thank you. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you one of North America's leading scholars on Impressionism, Dr. Jennifer Thompson. Dr. Thompson is the Gloria and Jack Drozdick Curator of European Painting and Sculpture and curator of the John G. Johnson Collection at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She earned her master's and doctorate at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Since joining the European Painting and Sculpture Department in 1999, a department she now runs, she has played an essential role in interpreting, displaying, and developing the museum's collections of European art. She has published widely and curated many notable exhibitions, including The Impressionists' Eye, Old Masters Now, celebrating the Johnson collection, Discovering the Impressionists, Paul Durand-Ruel, and the New Painting, Van Gogh, Up Close, Late Renoir, and most recently, The Artist's Mother, Whistler and Philadelphia, an exhibition that returns James McNeill Whistler's iconic portrait to the city after 142 years from the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. On view now at the museum until October 29th. And if that wasn't enough, Dr. Thompson also serves as the curator of the Rodin Museum in Philadelphia. Please help me welcome Dr. Jennifer Thompson.
Thank you. That was a very, very kind introduction. It's a delight to be here tonight, and especially to help celebrate the gift of a remarkable collection to St. Vincent College. I had the pleasure this afternoon of spending time with it, and I have to say, I'm deeply jealous of all the curators and students and members of this community that get to enjoy this collection and to consider and explore all the new paths that it's going to offer for scholarship and for contemplation. So let's start with a picture from the collection. In the year 1900, numerous articles appeared in the English language press, asking the question, what is Impressionism? The artistic movement bearing this name was barely 25 years old, yet it had already shaken up art establishments and academies around the globe. Even though few art enthusiasts living outside of Paris would ever have had an opportunity to see Impressionist paintings at first hand, Impressionism was fervently debated in newspapers as wide-ranging cities from Buenos Aires to Cincinnati, to Melbourne, to Tokyo. And as you might imagine, given that vast spread, the term had a number of different meanings. And in fact, any artist who broke from tradition and left obvious marks of his or her hand and their craftsmanship was often perceived as revolutionary and modern, and therefore given the label, an impressionist. But tonight I want to explore what Impressionism meant to British artists and audiences in the early 1900s. And I want to do so using paintings from the Impressionist Legacies exhibition, which is beautifully installed just across campus. My focus on British Impressionists reflects a particular strength of the Rusinko Kakos collection. Not surprisingly, it was largely formed in the UK. But by focusing in on this particular group, I think it's one way of sort of starting to dig into all that the collection offers. There are, as Andrew mentioned, 61 artists in the show, and I thought a lecture of 61 artists, 61 artist biographies might keep us here all evening. So I'm going to focus in on about a dozen British works and use them to explore a flow of artists and ideas across the channel, and to start to understand some of the debates that were happening in British literary circles, when some critics and writers started to argue that Impressionism actually had English origins. But before delving into that question, it's necessary to start with how Impressionism got its name. In April 1874, 30 artists exhibited 165 paintings in Paris, in this building, on the upper floors. You can just maybe see the words Nader written across the facade. It was in a building that had recently been vacated by the photographer Nader, and it was in a neighborhood that was within easy walking distance of the Musée du Louvre. It was in a well-trafficked commercial area. The artists decided to call themselves the Anonymous Society of Painters, Sculptors, and Printmakers. And they were an exceedingly diverse group of French men and women who had three goals. They wanted to show their work in an exhibition without a jury or without honorary awards. They wanted to sell their work, and they wanted to create a journal that would cover the arts and probably help to promote them as well. The opening of the exhibition occurred just 2 weeks before the annual Spring Salon, which offered, and their exhibition offered an alternative to this state-sanctioned exhibition, to which thousands of artists would submit 2 works each spring, hoping that at least one would be accepted. The Impressionists could submit as many works as they wanted to the exhibition, and there was no jury. Everything was automatically accepted, and they could all have a say in how it might be hung. So the 30 artists who'd exhibited in these spaces had often been rejected from the salon, and they were really struggling to bring visibility to their work. They included some well-known names today, such as Edgar Degas, and the works I'm going to show you now are just a selection of things that were in that first exhibition. This is a work by Camille Pissarro. Berthe Morisot is one of the founding members of the Impressionist group, and I think that's one of the striking things about the Impressionists, is that it was a group that was formed by men and women, and we'll see that theme come up again with the British Impressionists. Paul Cézanne exhibited in the first exhibition, but there were also a number of other artists, and it was a particularly wide-ranging group. Among them was Adolf Felix Kulz, who at age 64 was one of the oldest artists in the group. Another one was Jacques-Emile Brandam, who exhibited this interior of a synagogue. And then, of course, there was this work, which I'll get to in just a minute. The Impressionists charged an entry fee of about 1 franc, and they saw over 3,500 visitors, which is a pretty astonishing number. When you consider that they, in fact, were charging a fee, the annual salon was free, and they had about 50 notices in the press, which enabled them to feel encouraged, so much so that they would continue on in future years. But not all the criticism was positive. While some critics recognized the modernity and the innovative painting style of the works on view, others saw it as a chance to kind of flex their satirical muscles. And among them was a frustrated printmaker and playwright named Louis Leroy, who wrote an article that he called Exhibition of the Impressionists, in which he singled out this work by Monet for ridicule. Monet had given the work the title Impression Sunrise, and when he was asked later why he'd given it this title, it was a painting he'd painted looking out of a window in Le Havre Harbor one morning. He said, they wanted to know its title for the catalog, and because it really couldn't pass for a view of Le Havre, I said, use impression. Well, Leroy, the critic, would joke that Monet's painting certainly made an impression, and added, wallpaper in its most embryonic state is more finished than that seascape. Another reviewer quipped, this impression of a sunrise has been dealt with by the immature hand of a schoolboy who spreads pigment for the first time on whatever surface he can find. And to their eyes, Monet's picture lacked a subject, a focus, and any sort of refinement. They were deliberately missing his goal, which was to capture quickly in paint what his eyes had experienced one watery, misty morning. The critic, Jules Antoine Castagnari, sort of better understood this, and he sought to give the group some definition. He wrote, these are everyone's personal notes. The common concept which unites them as a group and gives them a collective strength in the midst of our crumbling epoch is the determination not to search for a smooth execution, but to be satisfied with a general aspect. Once the impression is captured, they declare their work is done. If one wants to characterize them with a single word that explains their effects, one would have to create the new term of Impressionists. And the artist would resist this name for several years, finally giving into it after numerous other articles came out. And in 1878, they resigned themselves to be calling the Impressionists. Their first exhibition, as I mentioned, was so successful in making sales and drawing attention that they repeated the enterprise 7 more times, each time in a different venue and with a different group of artists. Within the course of those sort of 12 years, the project that they had launched created a new form of painting that would have ramifications and appeal across the globe. So while about a dozen of the artists who exhibited in those shows have become familiar names, there are others who have yet to be seriously studied or appreciated. And among them is Paul Victor Vignon, an artist who's included in the Impressionist legacies. Vignon exhibited in 4 of the 8 Impressionist exhibitions, first joining the group in 1880. He was 10 years younger than many of the Impressionists, and he had trained with Calls, who showed you that who painted that farm view I showed you a little while ago. And he worked alongside Pissarro and Cezanne in the 1870s. And as you can see here, in this painting in the exhibition, as well as this one, he made full use of his palette, bringing together blues and greens and rust colors, and employing a sort of repetitive diagonal brushstroke. But his manner of working sort of mirrored that of some of his colleagues, and some felt he wasn't inventive enough. Monet criticized him for his sharp outlines and said that he wasn't a true impressionist, and others commented on the fact that he used brown and gray shadows. I think, frankly, they were a little more concerned about the competition that he offered them. And Vignon was, in fact, held in very high regard by Pissarro and Morisot, Renoir, and even Cassagne, and he was well represented by the Durand-Ruel Gallery. His work also appealed to collectors. One of his canvases was acquired by the young art dealer Theo Van Gogh, who hung it in his Paris dining room, the one he shared with his brother Vincent. And later, Vincent Van Gogh expressed the hope that Vignon, Bernard, or Gauguin would join him at his utopian studio in the south of France. And Vincent Van Gogh's life, and maybe the history of art, might have been a little different if the even-tempered Vignon and not the hot-headed Paul Gauguin had joined him in the Yellow House in Arles. But vision and heart problems meant that Vignon largely stopped working in the late 1880s and limited his production. But interestingly, for our discussion this evening, an 1890 letter by Camille Pissarro indicates that poor Vignon was enjoying greater success on the other side of the Channel than in France. And his appeal, according to one critic, was that he offered a transition between what has been and what will be, the art of yesterday and the art of tomorrow. And I offer this solely as a kind of suggestion of the opportunities that there are in the Rusinko Kakos collection to kind of further expand and maybe in some ways complicate our study of Impressionism. And particularly this question of defining who is and who isn't an Impressionist. And to sort of explore how we might define Impressionism, I'm going to use a definition that was provided in 2000 by the art historian Richard Brettel. And he created a 6-point definition of Impressionism. I put it up here, but I'll read through it quickly and try to make some sense of it for you. According to Brettel, an Impressionist work is a work begun under the direct stimulus of a motif selected by the artist. We might interpret that as the artist painting on the spot. An Impressionist painting might be brought to form without a clear plan for its finished appearance. So this means that the artist may be developing his ideas on the canvas. He's not doing a lot of studies. He or she is working quite spontaneously. It might be a work that demonstrates a frank use of materials with no attempt to disguise its process. And that's something that I think comes out so strongly in the works in Impressionist legacy. You can see how they're made. You can see the brushstroke. You can see the paint coming directly from the tubes. It's a painting composed of gestural language unique to the artist. That means that each artist has its own way of mark making, of using the brush, the different ways of building up brush strokes and building the paint surface. A work that seems to have been painted in a short period of time, and then a painting that was completed by the artist through the act of signature or exhibition. But using all of those points, let's look closely at one work in Impressionist legacies. William K. Blakelock's Flower Picker. And as you see here, there's a fall of sunlight that's coming across this woman's shoulders, and there are patches of brighter color in the grass and foliage around her, all suggesting to me that this was painted out of doors, under direct observation, and that it is not something that could have been done from memory in a studio. And our proximity as the viewer to this flower picker is also striking. We aren't looking down at her, but rather looking across from her, as if the artist was not standing at an easel, but was in fact seated in the grass, looking across at this woman. Furthermore, there's no horizon line, there's no sky visible, and even the trees on either side here are severely cropped, giving a kind of narrow focus and intimacy to this scene. You'll have to go to the gallery to see all of this, but I hope I can pull it out in the slides. There's a very thinness to the paint here. You might see little flecks of white off to either side of the woman. Those are bare bits of canvas. The artist hasn't even tried to fill every inch of canvas. He's left little bits of the bare canvas visible. So that suggests it's not a labored product. And in fact, there's no sign of underdrawing or any kind of thickly encrusted paint here. We can see the artist's process and begin to understand the sequence with which he worked. I'll give you a detail to help with this. For instance, we can make out the blades of grass and the flowers, the stems that he's drawn across her apron. And if you look closely at the sort of triangle of the purple skirt that we see here, you might see that there are a couple of sinuous lines of paint that seem to be blue and white. And you could tell on close inspection that he's dabbed his brush into a little bit of white paint and a little bit of blue paint, and he's applied them to canvas without trying to blend them. He's applying the sort of pure pigment in this fashion. And in this sense, we get a sense that he's working quickly. He's working with wet paint. If you look in the lower portion of this slide, you can also see maybe a dab of bright yellow paint. And this is pure paint that's coming from the tube. He's not bothering, as he has with her skirt, to kind of try to make some purples. He's using some pure greens and pure yellows here. So all of this suggests that he's working quickly, perhaps in one afternoon, and he's studying light and color and sensation. And to get back also to another point that Bertel had made about gestural language or marks that look we can start to see as a signature of the artist. I'll show you something of a close-up of another work, and maybe you'll start to see some of those dabs and dashes of color might look a little familiar to you, or the stems of branches and flowers. And that's just a segment of another work done by Blakelock in roughly the same period. Blakelock was born in 1872, just 2 years before the first French Impressionist exhibition, and he studied in London and Edinburgh before moving in 1906 to an artist colony called Walberswick on the Suffolk or the east coast of England. And there he worked aside a number of other British artists, many of whom are represented in the collection: George Clausen, Bertram Priestman, Bernard Dunstan, just to name a few. And while there, Blakelock married Ellen, known as Nellie Richardson, who is thought to have been the sitter both for this painting and the one I showed you before. And as Andrew Julo has noted in the exhibition catalog, it's especially fitting that Nellie is seen surrounded by flowers, since she was herself a painter of floral still lifes. It's kind of interesting to think that maybe she's picking these flowers to take them inside to do her work. Blakelock was likely familiar with the work of French Impressionists, since those artists were in fact regularly in the UK. It was only a 12-hour journey between Paris and London. One could take a train from Paris to Boulogne, where you could meet this steam packet that would carry you from Boulogne across the channel to Folkestone Harbour, and there you could take a train ride to London. Edward Manet did this in 1868 and commemorated the trip with this painting, showing a jostling crowd of passengers about to embark. And then in the 1870s, both Claude Monet and Camille Pissarro spent the fall and winter of 1870 in London. They were avoiding the Franco-Prussian War. They were worried about being conscripted and had young families that they wanted to keep out of the conflict. So during that moment, they painted the parks and suburbs of the city. Monet, we know, lived just on the edge of Green Park, and so it's quite reasonable and highly likely, if not certain, that he carried this 13 by 28-inch canvas and his portable easel from his lodgings across to the park. Most ironically, it was in London where he was introduced to the French dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel, who would become the great advocate, supporter, and financial underwriter of the Impressionists, organizing exhibitions for them and building a stock as well of British Impressionists. To continue on our story of the French Impressionists being in London, Degas stopped in London on his way to New Orleans in 1872. Berthe Morisot spent part of her honeymoon visiting London museums. Alfred Sisley visited in 1874 to see the country where his parents had been born. And Monet and Pissarro would return again and again, with Monet starting his famous Thames series in 3 visits between 1899 and 1901. Mary Cassatt would go almost every summer to catch the exhibitions in Paris. And I hope that I'm building a picture that while often art history is thought about being all about Paris in this moment, there's obviously a lot of art that was going on in London, and the French painters were very much aware of what was happening there. And then in 1905, Durand-Ruel held this magisterial exhibition of French art in London. He organized an exhibition of some 315 Impressionist paintings by Renoir, Monet, Pissarro, and Degas. It was the largest Impressionist exhibition, I think, ever organized. And it was demonstrating, as he hoped, that Impressionism was sort of here to stay. Durand-Ruel had hoped that it would be this great marketing and sales opportunity. He ended up selling only 11 works out of the 315 that he had shipped over to London. But it had a remarkable impact for a number of scholars, and particularly for artists. And for our British artists, because they had an opportunity, particularly those of the younger generation, perhaps like Blakelock that we saw earlier, to really see and understand what the French were doing. And of course, the Folkestone boat also transported British artists to Paris, a city that was for many considered to be the cultural capital, one filled with studios and museums and the annual Salon exhibition. And a number of the British artists spent time there. Among them, George Clausen, a London-born artist who studied at the South Kensington art schools, and whose early style is very well represented by the novel, a canvas in which you see a woman depicted in this wonderful ascetic movement environment. There's a Japanese teacup and saucer, a teapot, sitting on top of this wonderful octagonal inlaid mother of pearl stool, and then a marvelous sort of sofa with an arm. This is a painting that's very much about beauty and refinement, and reflects sort of what was being taught in the schools in London at the time. But after a few months working in Paris in 1883, Clausen's eyes were opened to a completely different manner of working, that of working outdoors and of brightening his palette. And I think that's well represented by this painting, known as Brown Eyes, which is typical of his more mature style. You can see a brighter palette here. The whole background is just almost vibrating with this very active and visible brushstroke. And we see here his sort of turn to a rural subject matter in thinking about the lives of people living in England, and really the work of maintaining its fields and producing the crops which supported those living in the city. He became a leading proponent of British Impressionism, and he encouraged many other artists. Among them was Dorothea Sharp, who used an inheritance from an uncle to enroll in art school in London. Clausen was one of her teachers, and it was probably his advice that led her to spend some time in Paris in the 1890s. And there, she wrote of encountering Claude Monet's work and seeing it as pivotal. And you might see some echoes of Monet's work in this sort of windswept view of children on the grassy hills of her native Kent. I went looking around at other works by Dorothea Sharp, and I tempted to think that the model for the painting of the Rusinko Kakos collection might in fact be the young girl that we see carrying a pail in this work. But I think it gives you a sense of Sharp's work at this moment, and particularly this good palette that she's using of greens and yellows, and also, as we'll see again here, a very high horizon line and something of a plunging, pitching perspective, which is very much part of what experimental artists were doing at this moment. While it's unknown whether Sharp or Clausen knew Monet or any of the Impressionists personally, the situation's quite different with Mark William Fisher, a Boston-born artist who would spend 50 years, the bulk of his working life, in the UK. While he initially took classes at the Lowell Institute and made a living as a sign and house painter, he then transitioned to portrait painting, and thanks to the sponsorship of a Massachusetts patron, traveled to Europe, where he entered the studio of Charles Glare in 1863. His fellow students there were Alfred Sisley and Claude Monet. And we know from a letter that Camille Pissarro's son, Lucien, wrote to him in 1883 that Fisher was very much on the radar of the Impressionists. Lucien wrote to his father, "There are really only two painters in the exhibition I saw in London which did not make me regret the money I had paid for admission. Mark Fisher, a landscapist, who draws trees in a very knowledgeable way and paints freely, and Millet, who is not an artist who works in the Impressionist vein." His father wrote in reply, "Mark Fisher must be one of our imitators, because he has worked in France." We'll come back to this point. "I was told that he was stronger than us, and above all, more studied." Fisher would reply of Pissarro and of all his French colleagues, they were the best men of the day. And Fisher is indeed a pivotal figure for the first generation of British artists who adopted the notational style and free work, brushwork of the Impressionists. He was, for instance, the father of Margaret Millie Fisher-Prout, who would develop this very distinctive sort of flickering brushstroke. And this is a work that I would strongly encourage you to go back over and look at in the Roscoe Center, because her brushwork is just astonishing, and I'm not doing it justice in this slide. Fisher was also friendly with George Clausen, with Stanhope Forbes, with Wilfrid de Glen, Alfred Hacker, and in other members of the New English Art Club, a London-based art society that formed in 1886, the very year of the last Impressionist exhibition. And the New English, as it came to be called, offered an alternative to the annual exhibitions of the Royal Academy of Arts in London, and often favored younger artists and women artists as well. But one of the things that we see in the Impressionist Legacies exhibition, and many of the works that I've been showing on the screen, is this practice of painting outdoors on small canvases or panels. And this generally indicates that they're portable works that could be produced over the course of a few hours. And the practice, we should note, of painting outdoors en plein air was not new to the Impressionists and had been employed by artists for about 150 years. But it became considerably easier in the 1930s with the introduction of mass-produced tin paint tubes. This simple and quite seemingly obvious invention meant that artists could buy a tube of paint, expect a reliable and consistent color, squeeze a small portion of it onto their palette, and seal the tube up for use on another day. They no longer had to determine in advance what colors they might use. They didn't have to mix the colored pigments into a binder like linseed oil, and they didn't have to seal it into a pigskin bladder. This was something that John Constable and William Turner, two British landscape painters, had to do when they painted outdoors. And I'm showing you here Turner's painting box with all those pigskin bladders filled with now very dry and desiccated paint. This, in fact, was so cumbersome that Turner would decide to paint only with watercolor or graphite outdoors, leaving paint for the studio. I'm going to go back one slide just to show you some of the array of equipment that was also available to these artists by the 1880s. You could buy portable easels, paint boxes, or umbrellas. And while Fisher's painting kit doesn't survive, there are a number of printed catalogs giving us a sense of what he might have had, and this is a painting kit that survives for a French artist. Ironically enough, most of this equipment was developed for amateur artists, so that they didn't have to, it was thought that maybe it was too complicated for them to mix pigments and to sort of get that, fully sort of refined. It was also women artists, amateur women artists who often used this material. And I read that the paint tube was actually initially marketed for women because it was clean and it was odorless, so it was perfect for using in the drawing room. So it's somewhat ironic that, of course, it became the tool or the piece of equipment that is so widely used later in the century for a variety of artists, and particularly professional artists working out of doors. So a critic wrote of Fisher's method in 1910. He just walks out, sees something, feels an irresistible desire to paint it, and proceeds to paint it in the open air. Another would call him Happy Mark Fisher in response to the glittering, sun-filled, optimistic pictures that he painted. But Fisher worked hard at his craft and no doubt had many more bad or challenging days than his biographers credit. But his habit, along with that of Dorothea Sharp and many other contemporaries, of painting landscapes devoid of modern tension and politics, is something that he shared with the French Impressionists, who largely steered away from depicting the class struggles or the political strife of these years. Instead, they focused on recording what they saw, and in doing so in a seemingly neutral way that created works that have lasting appeal and were especially well suited for hanging in the walls of private homes, rather than in a museum or an academy, where tradition usually demanded that paintings carry moral messages that would inspire, uplift, or caution viewers. So when Fisher painted this scene of two women in an orchard near his home at Hatfield Heath, northwest of London, he was being modern in his rejection of a moralizing or historical subject. But he was also participating in a much longer English landscape painting tradition. So depicting the English countryside, its pastures, waterways, village churches, at a time of increasing industrialization and urbanization, was a way of kind of holding modernity at bay and had roots in English tradition. One of the most noted and prolific painters of rural England, John Constable, was devoted to the Suffolk countryside in which he grew up. As his career developed in the years around 1808, and as he increasingly lived in London in the winter, he would undertake summer painting campaigns in the fields, lanes, and canals around his father's home. He would take out small scraps of canvas. This is one that's only 6 by 9 inches, or pieces of cardboard, and he'd paint clouds. He'd paint breeze moving through leaves. He'd paint sunsets, mills, swiftly flowing waters. This is a view of the River Stour. And this is one, if you could just make out on the left edge of the painting, you might see a kind of wrinkle. That wrinkle actually also goes up along the top edge. This is the edge of a piece of canvas that originally had been stretched, so that he'd taken it off of a stretcher, he'd laid it flat. He has these ripples, he has these folds on the surface. He doesn't care. He's absolutely determined to catch the effect of 27th of September, 1810. He's actually added that very precise date to the upper left. All of this was a way of gathering material, the images, sensations, colors, and light effects that he could use when he was back in his London studio and working up very large-scale paintings for exhibition at the Royal Academy. Constable was working on these in sort of 1810, 1820, so almost a century before the work of Fisher and others that we were looking at earlier. But these oil sketches that Constable made were for his own use only. And when he died, after his death in 1837, and they started to clean out his studio, they found these sketches tucked everywhere, and they weren't mounted. They were all kind of crumpled up. So much so that a friend of the family advised his children, "I think you had better lock up all the loose sketches, of which I saw some lying on the floor of the painting room." Fortunately for us, Constable's children followed that advice, and as they started to sell the contents of his studio, they initially found buyers for the very large, finished pictures that met the standards of the day, and they held back on these smaller sketches because there wasn't much of a market for them. But in 1880, his children lent 50 of these small sketches to the South Kensington Museum, which we know today as the Victoria and Albert Museum. And this was followed in 1887 by the gift of 92 preparatory sketches. The London Times would write of things like these: "Modern taste is extremely in favor of such studies from life, the faithful and brilliant transcripts of the thing of the moment, nature caught in the eye." And it's hardly a coincidence that Constable's sketches found appeal in London at the very moment when Impressionism was gaining in acceptance. I've no doubt that Constable would be aghast to know that these sketches are today some of the most highly regarded and influential of his works. He himself would have prized a highly worked and highly finished studio painting, a painting in which you're not really aware of the brushstroke. But it's the immediacy of sketches like this one that speak to us today and have so much more in common with Impressionism. And I've no doubt that we appreciate these and look at them with a different eye, with a different lens today, because we see them through Impressionism. And this is one of his most impressionist works, called It's a sketch for the earlier work. So when he was preparing this painting in his studio in 1822 to 24, he actually worked up a full-size sketch. He had a sort of slight nervousness that he'd be able to pull it off. So he did an extraordinarily freely worked sketch to make sure that he liked the composition before he embarked on the finished work. So for Constable, the sketches were a means to an end, something that he would never have exhibited. But for the Impressionists, of course, they were an end in themselves. Constable's reappraisal in the 1890s had a very powerful impact on younger artists. And English critic Philip Hamerton recognized a link to French art, and he would write of these studies that they remind one of French sketches. And in fact, almost all of Constable's foreign sketches have a French air. The reason being, not that Constable imitated foreign art, for he was British to the backbone, but because he is the father of genuine nature study amongst the French landscape painters. Constable's impact on his own countrymen was sizable, and echoes of his subject matter and free brushstrokes can be seen in the work, I think, of Bertram Priestman, a Yorkshire-born artist who studied at the Slade School in London and traveled to Europe before spending several decades in Suffolk. Constable's attention to detail and his palette find parallels in Albert Rotherston's 1906 view of a French village, or, much later, Frank Boothman's landscape, in which a plow rests at the edge of a field, a quotation that I think might be from a Constable view of Stoke-by-Nayland. But I'll leave you to explore all of these painters and to think and to appreciate their own brushstrokes and what they bring to each of these subjects in the exhibition. Constable's exact contemporary and rival, JMW, known as William Turner, exerted an equally powerful impact on French and English artists in this period. Winfried Dewhurst, a painter and writer who published Impressionist Paintings, Its Genesis and Development in the year 1904, declared, "Impressionism owes its birth to Constable. Its ultimate glory, the works of Claude Monet, is profoundly inspired by the genius of Turner." Dewhurst would go on to note, those Englishmen who are taunted with feeling by the methods of the French Impressionists, sneered at for imitating a foreign style, are in reality but practicing their own. for the French artists simply developed a style which was British in conception. Not surprisingly, these were fighting words for the French artists, who took umbrage at this assessment, which begins to evoke some of the nationalism that becomes part of the discourse around Impressionism in these years. Pissarro would readily admit that the watercolors and paintings of Turner and Constable had an influence on him, and he once scolded his son Lucien, saying, "You've been to the National Gallery, you've seen the Turners, but you don't mention it them. Can it be that the famous painting, Rain, Steam, and Speed, did not, and the little sketches by Turner, did not impress you?" And it was paintings like this, the atmospheric and color effects that come out, as well as the embrace of modern technology, that appealed to the Impressionists. As did Turner's sort of self-taught techniques. He used experimental techniques in which he would rub his fingers, his thumbnails, a palette knife to apply paint. And he employed a very unusual mixture of materials, all of which might have spoken to the Impressionists. I'm showing you here a little sketch by Pissarro that if you applied to the basement room of the National Gallery in London in the 1870s, 1880s, you could apply to see this. We know that Pissarro did so, but not so sure about whether Monet did, even though it's striking to wonder whether this view of Le Havre, painted in 1832, might have inspired Monet when he did his Impression Sunrise of 74. Monet, who was ever cagey about his sources of influence or about other artists, said to a friend late in life, "At one point I greatly liked Turner, but today I like him much less. He did not draw enough with color and he used too much of it. I have studied him closely." We can see some of the tensions that artists feel around the subject of artistic individuality and independence. And this is something that, of course, British and French artists globally would share, as each artist was really seeking to bring something new to the table in this period. And I wonder if it wasn't the looming shadows of Constable or Turner that encouraged other British artists to bring more contemporary notes into their landscapes by fusing them with figure subjects. And we find in the early years of the 20th century a kind of Edwardian Arcadianism, a kind of romantic, idyllic view of the countryside that begins to find its way into some pictures, and surely I think would have appealed to city dwellers. An especially versatile artist who studied at the Royal Academy in London and later in Paris, Arthur Hacker tapped into this sentiment in 3 paintings painted in around 1900 to 1901. This is a painting that you'll find in the Impressionist Legacies exhibition, and I encourage you to take a good long look at it because it's wonderful in the way that it is worked. He's used a dramatic overhead perspective. He presents one end of a canoe. I presume it's awkward to know where we are. Where is the artist? It's almost like he's hovering above the water just outside the edge of this canoe. But he shows her grasping the stem of a water lily, and there are details of her dress, her hat, the fall of light onto the boat, the back of a seat that we see in the boat that is wonderfully worked up. But if you look to the background, and in particular to the upper right corner, we see an extraordinary kind of explosion of brushwork that's worked very, very wetly in block-like dashes. You can see the striations of the brush itself. But yet this is also a finished work. He's signed and dated it in the lower center portion of the canvas. He produced another work, which is in a private collection. I don't quite know where it is, but he shows the sitter from another angle. This seems to be a much more heavily worked picture where we're less aware of that brush stroke here, at least in the foreground in her clothing and her hat. Background, we start to see sort of elements of that very free brushwork. And then he does another work that's dated 1901, although I suspect it might have been done earlier in 1900 with this other series, and maybe he just dated them at a different moment. But this is a work in which he's zoomed back out to show us the entire scene of the punt with these 2 models. He's even given us details of of the birds in the background. And there's a wonderful play here of sort of simultaneously blurring and narrowing in our focus. So he's using this very intense realism alongside these impressionistic devices. So he's trying to do something very, very, very new in his own terms. As is Laura Sylvia Goss, whose view of children clustered around a water fountain appears to be entirely unstaged, and yet it also seems to almost evoke a photograph in its very candid quality. No one looks out at the artist, no one looks at us. We're seeing them all from the sides or from the backs. And I think this low perspective and also seeing the back of this girl in a marvelous pink dress helps to build a very complex and layered composition that suggests spontaneity, even if the sort of stylized patterning of the folds and this encrusted colored surface makes us aware of the artist's handwork. Goss was a pupil and sometimes assistant of Walter Sickert, an artist who had very close connections to Degas in the Impressionists. So we might see her carrying their interest in observation, gestural language, the use of materials, all of those elements we defined as part of Impressionism earlier tonight. She's carrying all of those forward into a very new language. So if you're feeling less certain about how to define Impressionism now than you were at the beginning of my talk, I may in part have succeeded because it is a complex artistic movement. It's one that is far less homogeneous and more diverse than current scholarship or the blockbuster exhibitions that, I'm ashamed to say, people like me have put on for the last several years would have us believe. And I think all of the works that I've shown you tonight and that you can see in the Impressionist Legacies exhibition demonstrate that Impressionism did not have a single system or regularity, and that it encouraged, just as Castagnari noted in 1874, the making of personal notes. And I would argue that that is really what we're looking at when we're looking at something like the Rusinko Kakos collection. We're looking at personal notes of artists, and it pays off sort of stopping and slowing down and taking a good hard look at them. And it's also worth thinking about artists outside of Paris, because Paris had its delights and challenges for all artists, including all of the French Impressionists. While it was a center for art training, the art market, and for exhibitions, it was equally a place rooted in tradition, and it was filled with other artists. And that proximity of other artists always meant that one was looking over one's shoulders. And I'd like to close with a statement made by the young Claude Monet in 1868, as he was working in the seaside town of Étretat on the Normandy coast. And I think this is a sentiment that might be echoed by nearly all the artists that we've seen tonight, or that we might encounter across the street in the Verosco Center. One is too preoccupied by what one sees and hears in Paris, however strong one is. What I shall paint here will at least have the merit of not resembling anyone else, or at least I think so, because it will simply be the expression of what I myself have personally experienced. Thank you.